Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Professor George Pullen, who is a free market economist and who for the last decade has been refining his economic philosophies as a senior economist at the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission in Washington, D.C. Previous to that, he worked as a trader, portfolio manager, and a banker. He is driven by a curiosity and passion for convergence, connecting people and ideas across diverse disciplines and finding new questions that need answers. George is the author and co-author of 6 books on economic topics related to deep tech and a partner and chief economist for Milky Way Economy, Forecasting and Strategy for the Fifth Industrial Revolution of the Space Economy. George Pullen, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be on today. I think we're going to have a great conversation, and I can't wait to get going.
Yes, excellent. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, George, will cover the space economy, unsurprisingly, and national security related matters. But before we get into this, not mentioned in the bio that I just read, you're also a Marine. Could you tell our audience about your time in the Marines and how did these experiences carry through into your work today?
Certainly. Well, first of all, John, Semper Fi. I know you're a Marine too.
Yes, Semper Fi.
So I was in the Marine Reserves. I joined when I was still in high school, and I served 6 years honorably. I also was in the Navy ROTC with Marine option. Unfortunately, I actually got in a car accident one day after drill, and so which actually led to me going to physical therapy for a year. It was really kind of a mess, but I really enjoyed my time in the Marine Corps. I did have ambitions to, put on some bars and maybe even some stars, but it didn't end up going that way. So instead, you're stuck with your favorite space economist.
All right. What time frame was that, George?
97 through 03.
Gotcha. All right, excellent. Well, so I would imagine most in our audience are not nearly as tied into what's happening and what's being planned in space. So what does the space economy consist of?
Great question and great way to level set for the audience. So I think the first thing we should do is paint a picture for people, which is today, the space industry generates about 500 billion, that's a B, $500 billion worth of activity every year. Now, $500 billion worth of activity juxtapose the world's economic GDP output of 100 trillion isn't that much, okay? But if you look at the changes that we've seen, particularly with respect to the militarization and the ability to put up smaller satellites and launch cost decreases and cadence of flights also picking up, we've seen an opening up of space. Some people call it the new space race. I prefer to call it the new space relay race, and we could dive into that if you wanted to. But when we think about where the space economy is heading, some forecasts from major banks have put it at anywhere from $1 to $2 trillion over the next several decades. Milky Way Economy, my think tank, we put it at closer to $4 trillion by the 2040s. That might seem like an ambitious forecast based on the lower forecasts of many different banks. But if you actually look at the forecast that the Chinese have put out from their space agency, they actually put at 10 trillion by the 2050s. So it's okay if you don't agree with my number, but you should be aware that it's not actually the the high water mark. There's actually other countries, the Chinese, who have a very active space program, who see the space economy opening up even more. When you see a space economy that might be either 4 trillion or even 10 trillion, and then put that next to a global economy of, as I mentioned today, currently 100 trillion, you can see how you'd be generating as much economic activity as we get from some continents today. So that means space, which is 100 miles up, right? Or technically 60 miles up, 100 kilometers up, but there's always some debate back and forth there on the Kármán line. But when we think about space and we think about an entire continent's worth of economic activity that's generating more per year than an Australia, a South America, an Africa, and all that economic activity is only happening 100 kilometers or more away, more likely closer to 250 or 350 sort of ISS levels, International Space Station. Sorry, I won't use too many acronyms.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so, and so as we see that opening up, that's a closer distance than you have for transport and international trade now. And that's open to everybody.
Could I ask another like level set question about that? Yeah, so I hear that a lot. Oh, it's a such and such size economy, $1 billion, $1 trillion economy. What does that mean exactly when you talk about space being $1 trillion or a $4 trillion economy? Like in like 101 speak, what does that mean?
That's a good way to do this too. Okay, so when we think about industries, I want you to think about the automobile industry, think about the food and beverage industry. And when we talk about industry, we're talking about the specific companies that provides goods, products, or services to that industry. Okay, that's what they do, and they sell those, and again, or provide the service. In terms of an economy, we're also now taking into account the second and third order players. So, for example, in the space economy, you could have someone who is developing indoor vertical farming techniques. And those indoor vertical farming techniques might be used to grow, high yield, high vegetable, vitamin content products and services closer to major cities. Okay, that's a big movement right now. Um, and then you see someone say, "Oh, but know what I could do? I could also license this out and maybe provide this for a space application." Now, is vertical farming part of the space economy? Yes, because it's providing a service to the space economy. Is vertical farming part of the space industry? Well, I would argue no, because of the definition of, again, industry versus economy. So when you think about the economy, you are going to get to a bigger number. And again, that's just because these second and third order operators and effects that you get on top of the standard good product and service definition of those companies that are within an industry.
So in like nerdy economic, you know, you know, tabulation, it can be real easy to accidentally double count things if you're not careful about how you define these various different ways of measuring economies or productivity, I guess.
Yes, and it's also important to always point out, that's why different economists will have different estimates. And we say that for everything, really. I mean, turn on Bloomberg or CNBC or Cheddar or whatever you prefer for your financial news, and you'll see two or three different economists with sometimes more than two or three different opinions. It's
Mhm.
because it's how we look at the world for our forecast, but it also has to do with what assumptions we're making and what data we're bringing in.
Yeah. All right. Oh, I think I got us sidetracked just a little bit. Do you have anything more to say about what the actual space economy consists of?
No, I I think it's good for people to think about it simply.
Hmm.
In terms of we have the launch component of the space economy. That's what everyone likes to think about, because there are giant explosions going off into space. And so think about launch as a component. Next, think about what's happening in space. And so for what's happening in space right now, we're primarily talking about satellites. Very soon, we'll be talking about more and more space stations. There are many different plans right now for commercial space stations, and I do believe we'll see that soon. And then the third component to think of after getting into orbit or launch and then in space would be the data and the products that are coming down from space. Now, right now, the only product that comes down from space is data. Occasionally, you will see missions return after successful tests on the ISS, for example, but that's not really a product that's being resold to the market. When we're talking about data, though, this ties in, I think, very closely with some of your discussions around, cognitive and information warfare. A lot of that data that's coming back down, that's a major part of the space economy. And that's what's fueling a lot of the growth in both launch and in operations of additional satellites and constellations.
I want to ask one other level set question, and this is kind of like a curiosity, another economics 101 kind of a question that dawns on me. Is like we hear so frequently that GDP growth is important, and on top of that, we hear constantly that uh, China, for example, that China's GDP is likely to surpass the United States GDP in, you know, various different estimates, right? Um, why is GDP growth such an important measurement, especially when it comes to national security and sovereignty and prestige on the world stage? Why does that matter?
That's a good question, and it should also help us, answer some economic curiosity questions for some of your listeners. So the first thing is, let's think about what GDP means, right? So it's gross domestic product, and so this is a measurement of how productive your entire nation is. Okay, so it takes into account all of the goods, products, and services your country is producing. Now, GDP comparisons start to get really complicated very quickly. And so you'll hear people throw out comparisons often. But what's important to remember is that the value of your dollar might not be the same as the value of my yen or my pound or my sterling or anything else, right? And so first thing about that, and then realize that the next part of the equation here has to do with your cost of living. Okay, so there's amount of parity in which you can purchase. It's called purchasing power parity. Sometimes that's also used for comparison, and you hear people throw it around with the term GDP. Then you have nominal GDP, and again, this is another way to sort of compare more evenly GDPs across countries. So if it's just the nominal GDP, you can see huge differences compared to relative GDP or pricing power parity. I think what's important for people to understand is that when they hear these phrases, they should look very carefully about which one the speaker is referring to, because you can get lost real quick in some of the nuance there. But what's more important than that is what these numbers actually mean for your audience for national security, right? And so when you have a country that is producing more gross domestic product, right, a bigger GDP, generally speaking, your tax base is a proportion of your GDP. And your tax base, what you're spending as a nation from a government's point of view for its national security, is then a percentage again. And so think about a country that is producing more, it can then spend more on national security and defense. So this is it's an important feedback loop that's important to keep in mind. I think too, the other part of this is how it relates back to space, and you knew I was going to take it there.
Sure, yeah,
um,
yeah.
how it relates back to space. So space is just another market and another area on which countries can compete or cooperate. And so a great example of cooperation is, of course, the ISS, peacefully providing cooperation between many nations for decades now, right? So that's a great example of cooperation in space. There's also a lot of cooperation in space that's occurred through various GPS and similar GNSS systems. These are what provide precision timing and locations. This is what lets me know if I've got my steps in, or helps me get the kids to grandma's house, right? That's what, and we're all really used to this, but it's also plugged into our economies and our supply chains and our logistics networks. That's all cooperation based, right?
Hmm.
But now think about competition. So if I have a alternative satellite network, then that alternative satellite network might also provide timing and precision location information. And by the way, there are many countries that now have their own networks that are similar to GPS. You have networks that are mostly European. You have networks. India has put up a network. India has a very vibrant space industry, by the way.
Mm.
They put up a network. The Chinese have their own network. So, and of course, the Russians have for a long time. So there's other networks, and so this also provides competition. It's also the same when it comes to information. So the country with the greatest amount of access to satellites, and then the data really is what's important, that satellite constellation is providing, that also gives them advantages. And so that could be advantages that are then translated to their companies, or it could be advantages that translate to them strategically for whatever they might be doing in the national security side.
Just so that I'm understanding what you're saying, the whole GDP question that I asked a moment ago, in very crude terms, the bigger a country's GDP, the more you can infer that they have the capacity to spend towards national security or
Correct.
towards defense related capabilities. And so
Correct.
if China's GDP is bigger than the United States, people could say, well, that means that China can outspend the US when it comes to defense and national security related capabilities, potentially.
Yeah, potentially. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
It's the same thing too when we look at space spending, right? So space spending by countries is approximately 100 billion, that's a B, dollars per year. Out of that 100 billion dollars per year that countries spend on space, 55 billion, or the majority, is actually US spending. That's important to keep in mind, just how large of a spend is coming from the US on space. Now, that though cannot be taken as one for one, right? So let's talk about our friends in India again, because again, I'm really infatuated with their space program. But if you look at what they were able to do a few years back with their Mars missions, they were able to get to the surface of Mars for under $75 million. So they literally spent less to get to the surface of Mars than the movie industry in the US spent to make the movie Martian. And like,
Wow.
so again, we can't always compare the dollar to dollar, because we have to understand that, for example, their wage rates are less than us in other countries, and also some of their input costs would be less than us in other countries. So when we think about the amount of spend a country has, GDP helps us to start to form that, but we should then also take a little bit deeper dive and think, but okay, what are their programs efficiencies? And obviously with some countries, it's not really clear and transparent, and how to
Right.
get to those numbers.
Right. And are there also costs that are typically borne by the first mover or the innovator? I mean, pick any endeavor, right? If someone is doing something for the first time, I'm imagining there's all kinds of costs of failure and experimentation, and then eventually success, and then someone who follows is likely to gather lessons learned, which also makes it less expensive to accomplish something similar.
Yeah, and you're right on point there. One of the things that this relates back to, and as you know, I have an appointment with Franklin Pierce, University of Hampshire's Law School, and they're the #1 IP school in the country. And so we talk about IP and intellectual protection a lot. Now, I just talk about the economics of the economics of these deep tech systems and all this IP they need to protect. But I will say that this is definitely a situation where there is a first mover advantage, but that first mover advantage goes away quickly if intellectual property is not being protected. There are some great examples of that. We can think about some of the technologies related to distributed ledger, DLT, or blockchain, as some people call it. We can relate it to advancements in AI, ML, so artificial intelligence, machine learning, even neural networks or deep learning, right? I mean, a lot of these technologies have come out of both large amounts of US company spending, or in some cases, US Department of Defense spending. And not all of that breakthrough technology has been developed here. And sometimes it's been developed rather quickly in other places. And I'll leave that for someone else to to suss through what I mean by that. But there's always examples of there is a first mover advantage, but sometimes the second mover can ride the coattails quite cheaply. I think the third thing to think about here when we're talking a little bit further afield is what we sometimes refer to as leapfrog effects.
Mm,
So one of the classic examples of a leapfrog effect has been the development of communication networks, particularly with respect to mobile and cell and data communications in the continent of Africa, where they never had to spend for the long distance telco lines that we've
mm,
spent for in the US and Europe. They have gone straight to mobile adoption. In fact, mobile adoption in some countries and cell phone usage in some African nations are actually greater than one cell phone per person. And so I point that up because that's an example of a leapfrog. So first mover is important, but from a strategy point of view, we should also be thinking about what happens when countries are able to leapfrog.
wow. Well, thanks for bringing up the patent stuff. So this is just another kind of a curiosity, 101 kind of question. So uh, I've always heard that things like NDAs, like non-disclosure agreements between companies. Companies do this all the time in order to have conversations about doing business together and without as much of a risk of one company taking another company's IP. But then I also hear that NDAs are notoriously hard to enforce. Uh, it would seem to me that patents are the same way, or wouldn't patents be similarly challenging to enforce because a patent is published publicly. There it all is, right? In stick and wire diagrams as to how a invention works. If a country or another business, just starts using a patent without telling somebody, how how would a patent be protected? I guess what I'm coming to is, okay, so China notoriously has been stealing patents or stealing IP, but as I was just describing, all of this is notoriously hard to enforce anyway. So, how do you respond to that kind of question space?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the things to think about when we think about NDAs or patents is if this is something that you're considering for your company, you should definitely get a good lawyer. And
Yeah,
University of New Hampshire Law School produces lots of good lawyers, none of which are me. And so,
gotcha.
people
Yeah.
people should definitely do that. For the second part of the question, in terms of NDAs or MNDAs, which are mutual non-disclosure agreements, I have signed plenty in my day. And I've also had companies that I've dealt with where we have both decided to look each other in the eyes and shake hands and reveal as much as we can to see if we can move forward. And I think it's because of the exact risks that you pointed out, which is enforcement of NDAs or mutual NDAs is sometimes very challenging. And it can also be very expensive, particularly if you are a smaller company, you're an entrepreneur, you're a startup, you think you have the next great thing, but you realize to get that next great thing out, you're going to need to partner with someone bigger. You are taking risks by doing that, certainly, and you have to weigh those risks, especially since we know that's not always easy to enforce those NDAs. So that's important. I think the next part in terms of patents, and one thing I wanted to clear up is not every part of a patent is necessarily published. So some inventors may choose to not have their application, for example, published. I know that there are obviously some very specific DoD, for example, or dual use cases where you would not want to have that published. The next is that we also can't assume that every country deals with the same patent laws. The patent laws in the US are not the same as they are every place else. And so when we look at global competition between actors, again, commercial or otherwise, they're competing on the world stage. And your intellectual protection that you have been granted through your local jurisdiction's patent office may or may not help you very much on the international stage. particularly depending on what country it is, and you mentioned one by name, particularly depending on what country it is that is trying to do that exact same thing. And
Mm.
I think the step before that, though, that's worth consideration as we kind of explore this thought space is what that means to our S&T and our R&D spend. So that's your science and technology and your research and development, STRD, spends here in the US. We spend a great deal of money subsidizing science and technology research and research and development funding. When we spend those dollars, we want to make sure that the people developing that intellectual property and the people that can then take that intellectual property and turn it into companies and solutions that we need are our friends. And a lot of the articles that I have read and a lot of the concern that comes up in conversations like this, and again, I don't claim to be an expert, but I understand the position, is that they're worried about the research being done by folks who aren't necessarily inclined to develop that further here in the States or use it for the benefit of US firms and US agencies.
George, I want to kind of ask you if you could, maybe synthesize everything that we've been talking about here. So there's at least three tenets that I'm tracking. We've been talking about data and space in general and national security. How do you bring these together?
That's a good question. So I think what the audience would want to have as their big takeaway here is that there is a disproportionately large amount of data that we currently get from space, both that benefits US companies, but also that benefits national security. And that big data that we're getting from space is only getting bigger. If you look at the announced launches and the number of new satellites going up, most put it at going from 5,000 active birds today, that's our slang for satellite, active birds today, up to 100,000 or more. That is a 20x increase in satellites. A 20x increase in satellites actually means more than a 20x increase in the amount of data that we're taking in. And again, that data is helping US firms achieve their goals and compete, but also national defense, because those new 100,000 sats that are going up are much more advanced than some of the older ones. And so it's going to be more than a 20x increase in data, particularly when we go into thinking about the advancements on the satellites themselves, advancements in ground stations and transmission, in space compute. So many things are happening at the same time. You could easily see, instead of a 20x, a 100x increase, a 100x increase in my data that we're getting for space. And that data that we're getting from space is going to play into our national security as much as it plays into our economic prosperity.
I'd like to maybe have a quick lightning round on space-related topics, and then we'll close it out. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, sounds fun. Yeah, sounds fun. Let's do lightning round.
All right, lightning round. So like a minute or so per response, that kind of thing. First, cislunar. What is cislunar and why does it matter?
Excellent. Cislunar, great question. A lot of times we talk about the space economy, and when we're talking about space economy, we're usually talking about 100 kilometers or more up, which is the Kármán line. And we're usually talking about things that are happening in LEO, which stands for low Earth orbit. That is the majority of conversations that you've probably ever heard about space, is the space that's taking place just a fingernail's width off the surface of the Earth, relatively speaking, to the size of our universe and our galaxy. When you talk about cislunar, you're pushing that little bit further out to the moon and the objects and space that's occupiable between the Earth and the moon. Okay, so cislunar is our ambitions for Artemis, which is our return to boots on the moon, where the first man and the first Black woman are probably going to sit down their boots here in the not too distant future. I'm very excited about Artemis. But I think that when you look at that, it's important to realize that that's a big push and a big extension of both economic activity, information gathering, because we're talking a lot about data in this call, but also how does that relate back to national defense? and national security? How do we protect commercial actors that want to go to the moon? And what does that look like? That's a lot of conversations right now.
Yeah. Uh, the notion that we will eventually become a spacefaring species.
Ooh, okay. So I'm gonna get a little controversial here, and I'm gonna say I would love to become a spacefaring species. I think that sometimes what happens when space nerds talk, though, they don't take that moment to pause and explain to folks that when we're talking about going to the stars, what we're really talking about for the next several decades is delivering advancements down and around the Earth. This isn't an up and out mission. Up and out missions, you're losing hearts and minds. You know that cognitive war. You are losing hearts and minds if you're talking about escaping, right? What people need to understand is the level of technology transfer that happens because of the research in space and the data collections in space, how much that improves their day-to-day lives. Think about the baby food crisis of last year. Baby food and many of the additives in baby food were actually developed by NASA to help the nutrition for scientists. And there are tons of other examples. You know, if you love your firefighters and you love all that amazing fire retardant gear that they use and some of those high pressure sprays that they use, that same thing that all came from NASA. So people need to understand that it's not so much about, beam me up, Scotty, which hey, I'm a big fan, right? But it's but it's also about delivering huge technology breakthroughs down and around to all of us here on Earth because we're pushing out.
Right, right. Last lightning round. Uh, the notion about infinite supplies of raw materials in space.
Yeah, so this is the whole post-scarcity economic debate. I've I've been on panels before with this, so it could be its own it could be its own show, but I promise to be lightning. Um, there are amazing resources off-world. And when we think about the type of future that we want to live in, we have to think about how the world handles a population of 10 billion, where all 10 billion of us are living at or above, because I hope we all keep getting better and better, what we enjoy here in the US. That future demands additional resources. Those additional resources could come from space. Um, I also think it's important to remember that when we talk about space, and our operations in space, particularly where we've had people, we're talking about systems that recycle 85 or 90% of water, that recycle huge amounts of materials. And so when we talk about space and its technology, sometimes we're also talking about circular economies, not just infinite economies because we're just getting more and more stuff from the heavens themselves.
Mm, mm. Um, Last lightning round. I'm adding one here. So, piggybacking on that, uh, would love to get your thoughts on the concept of manufacturing in space and bringing things back down to Earth, which were completely fabricated in space, and how that could potentially help uh, societies.
No, I love that question. So this is the, the little disclaimer. So Milkway Economy also has several investments in space companies, and so any
Okay.
examples I
All right.
say that relates to them, you'll know.
Okay. Gotcha.
But with ISAM and OSAM, and I don't actually know why we've decided to use two acronyms instead of one. But when talking about doing things in space, and potentially producing things in space, I get really excited. So the first thing is when we're talking about recycling plans for space debris and and companies using their orbital robots, so Rogue Space, right? That one of my companies, they might go out and grab a piece of space debris. To grab that piece of space debris, they need advanced electric propulsion. So that's neutron star systems. They go over there and they grab it. And when they grab it, they probably have a really amazing robotic arm that runs on, picnic software. And they grab that, and they bring it back, and they bring it back to on-orbit foundry, like Sisler Industries is working on. And that in-orbit foundry produces a new ignite, a new piece of aluminum. And you might say to yourself, why do we care about producing aluminum in space? Well, guess what most of these satellites are made out of, right? And so we can then recycle what's up there and make more things that we need in space from existing parts in space. That gets really exciting really quickly. In
Wow.
terms of
Yeah.
sending stuff back down to space, or sorry, in terms of sending stuff down from space,
Hmm.
and I know we're a little bit past lightning, but I think it's important.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, yeah.
Not just making it up there, but sometimes making it up there and bring it back down. It's unlikely that in that example we'd bring it back down because we'd use it up there still. Um, but when we're talking about bringing stuff back down again, we're talking about data, but really it's the information from the data that's valuable. So that's orbit's edge, on orbit computing and things like that. But we're also talking about very specialized products. So I believe biotech will lead the leasing of commercial space stations. You think about the way that genes fold in space. You think about the types of pharmaceuticals that can be developed in those environments. That doesn't mean that they are manufactured in space and brought down. They might be, or the techniques are perfected and then adapted to the ground. I think that's also more likely. So things like Z-Plan. So Z-Plan will make the robotics and cybernetics possible that so many of our vets need to have to have new appendages, new arms and new legs. That Z-Plan is the most high of high fiber optics that you can get, and faster than nerve endings in some cases that they've been demonstrating in labs. So think about what that would mean. That could likely be transported back down, but there's oodles of other materials like that.
Wow, I could keep on asking follow-ups, but I won't. Fascinating stuff. Closing out, George, we have a lot of students who listen to this podcast. Could you offer a fruitful research question that a student might examine?
Sure. I'll give you three really quick. The first is
All right.
space-based solar power. I'm a big fan of space-based solar power. I'm actually working on a paper myself right now, with some others, updating some of the economic assumptions and models around space-based solar power. I think that it could be really interesting about how that plays into our energy future. Another one is the impacts of spaceports. There are over 75 spaceports around the world. The spaceport, by the way, is where the space activity happens on the ground,
Okay.
here on
Okay.
Terran, on
Yeah.
Earth,
Yeah.
to support everything happening up in space. There's over 75 of those around the world, some quite a bit more active than others, just to be very clear there.
It not necessarily launch
Not
locations.
necessarily launch,
Uh-huh.
right? So a spaceport could also be where the important process of data analytics is happening, where
Mm,
ground systems are being run. These are all other things that could be happening at spaceports. Spaceports can also be, hotbeds of activities for space entrepreneurs, or spacepreneurs, as I like to call them.
okay.
Where she's discovering like the greatest new technology that can also be happening at spaceports and incubators. So, but the economic impact of spaceports should be really closely examined. There's been some wonderful spaceports that produce a lot of positive economic activities for their regions. There's also been some spaceports that have been some real boondoggles and
Mm,
spent hundreds of millions of taxpayers' money. So I
mm.
think that sort of economic research is important. And I think the third one I would look at, and it's not a shameless plug, but one of my first books, Blockchain: The Space Economy, is several years old now, and so some motivated student should do some updates, or at least offer to write a couple guest chapters, and I'd be more than happy to include it in a refresh.
Cool. 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 Yeah. Excellent thoughts there. And back to the spaceports thing. I've met one outfit that is doing space launches on water, like, or
Yeah.
a mobile space launch capability, where presumably you can tote something that looks like an oil rig or something like that, and put it wherever you want, and launch from the ocean, which is pretty cool. Okay. Awesome thoughts there. And finally, a book suggestion.
Sure. I will not do any any plugs for my own books, but if people are interested, they're available. You can find them on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, anything like that. And we cover plenty of topics related to space and to deep tech. Some of the ones that I've read recently that I'm a big fan of, Peter Garrettson's book, Scramble for the Skies. I
Hmm.
think it's a great read. Josh Carlson, he has a great book too. Space Power Ascending. I think for your audience, it would be a really great fit because it does talk about the dynamics between space and national security. Crystal Anglin, she was the author of a RAND report. Your audience could get that one for free. It's a RAND report. Download the PDF. It talks about tailoring deterrence for our space adversaries. That's a great one. And then my friend Professor Kaluki Lamont, he has one on the U.S. Space Force's grand strategy for national security. I think any of those are great reading, and most of them also have Audible, if that's your thing.
Excellent. All right. George Pullen, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
It was great, John. Thanks for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.